Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video episode on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian, and I'm here once again at Rock Island Auction House taking a look at some of the guns in their December 2014 premiere auction. Now, one that I thought would be pretty cool to take a look at for both mechanical and historical reasons is this Model 1865 Spencer rifle. Now, those of you who know quite a bit about Spencers will recognize that there are a few things wrong with this rifle, and we'll get to in a moment why those are actually right about this rifle and what makes it particularly interesting historically. In the large scale, the Spencer is an important rifle in military history because it was basically the first mass-produced and mass-issued repeating infantry rifle. These were used, tens of thousands of them in the American Civil War, and often these would go head-to-head against muzzle-loading single-shot muskets, where the men armed with these Spencers had a devastating advantage in firepower. The Spencer is a lever-action weapon, has a 7-round magazine, a tubular magazine in the buttstock. It fired the 56 caliber Spencer rimfire cartridge, which went through a couple iterations, but basically it was a 350 grain bullet running at about 1,200 feet per second. That may not sound like a barn burner by today's standards, but as far as energy-wise, that's about the same, if not a little bit more, than your typical 58 caliber muzzle-loading musket. And of course, this had 7 rounds on tap, as fast as you could run the action. Now, most of the Spencers that were in US military service were actually carbines, the vast majority. It was accepted as a carbine weapon, or a weapon. It was accepted for the cavalry, much more than it was for the infantry. And the cavalry, of course, got a carbine version with about a 10-inch shorter barrel. A small number were made as rifles. What's interesting about this one in particular, is that this is an example of a Model 1865, so a little bit later. They'd worked some of the kinks out of the design by that point. And this was originally made as a carbine. And then in 1871, Springfield Armory had about 1,100 of these Spencer 1865 carbines that had been rendered unserviceable, one reason or another, through hard use. And they decided to rebuild them as long rifles instead of carbines. So that is why we have this full-length rifle. It only has 2 barrel bands instead of the typical 3 you would find on a rifle. And on this side, it still retains the saddle ring and bar from when it was a carbine. Let's bring the camera in and take a little bit of a closer look at what makes the Spencer cool and how it operates. So let's start by taking a look at the markings. You can see this was originally a Model 1865 Spencer. It was manufactured by the Burnside Rifle Company, which did contract to make many of these guns for the US Army. The patent date on there is 1860. Now, like I said, this started out life as a carbine. Most of the Spencers made were carbines. About 94,000 carbines were manufactured, compared to only about 13,000 full-length rifles. So, of course, this would have been to attach a sling for a cavalryman, so that if he lost his grip on the rifle, he wouldn't drop it on the ground and ride off. It is a lever action. We have a lever down here, and the whole guts of the breech block come out when you open the lever. This obviously is one of the weak points of the rifle. If you start getting a bunch of dirt or grit on that, you can pretty easily render it non-functional. However, let's consider that this is 1860 or 1865, and this rifle, whatever its limitations, beats the snot out of having a muzzle-loading musket. Now, let's see, the same thing on the opposite side. I'm going to point out this right here, slightly mobile piece. That is the firing pin. This screw in the center acts as a stop for it. And as you'll see in a moment, the hammer hits back here, pushes this whole piece forward, and the front edge hits the rim of the cartridge. The 56 Spencer was a rimfire round. Some of these guns were converted to center fire later on, but that's another story for another day. As I open the lever, the breech drops slightly and then begins to rotate back. You can see this piece, this little tiny, flimsy, spring-loaded piece. That is the extractor. It sits under the rim of the cartridge, and as you pull the lever, it pulls the cartridge out of the chamber, brings it back, and then the cartridge rim starts to ride up this rail and eject out the top of the gun. Like this.
Now at this point, the breech block is all the way open. The spring in the magazine pushes a cartridge right up here underneath this lever. As I start to close the breech, the cartridge would be down on this area. It would be sitting right in here. The rim of the cartridge would be up against this flat breech face, and it would be pushing this lever up and out of the way. You can see just closing the breech pushes that lever up if I don't have a cartridge in there to do it. That then locks the breech, and you can see right here the exposed firing pin. So I can take that firing pin and push it forward with my finger just slightly, and that's just enough to crush the rim of the cartridge and fire it. The Spencer does have an external hammer here, and what this does is hit that firing pin. It also hits the edge of the receiver, so the receiver acts to stop the hammer from going too far forward, gives the firing pin just enough movement to fire the cartridge. Hold on to it. That's fired. We of course have a half cock safety position, and then full cock ready to fire. So the loading, the manual of operations for this rifle would be to open the action. That puts a cartridge on the breech face. Close the action. That chambers the cartridge. Then cock the hammer. Then drop the hammer. That fires the rifle. And the next time you open the action, it ejects the empty case. One of the elements that was added to these later models of the Spencer, and in fact one thing in specific that was added to the guns that were refurbished in 1871, like this one, was a device called the Stabler cutoff, because it was patented by a fellow named Stabler. It's this lever right here. Zoom in on that. This little guy rotates from pointing sideways to pointing back towards the trigger. When it's in this position, what it does is it limits the amount of travel of the breech block to just that far. This little block on the cutoff, right there, physically hits the breech block and stops it from moving any farther. What that does, if we look at the inside of the rifle, that limits the action to opening only this far, which is just enough to extract and mostly eject a spent case while keeping the magazine in reserve. So you can't open the breech block far enough in this configuration to let a cartridge out of the magazine. In effect, that's the same magazine cutoff that was so popular on pretty much all the other military rifles of the time, and all military rifles more or less up till World War I. When you were in a position where you wanted to make use of the magazine, say you spotted an Indian charge or a Confederate charge, you would rotate the cutoff into this alternate position. We now have the little block on it isn't in contact with anything, and we can fully operate the action, thus allowing cartridges out of the magazine and into the chamber. We have this nice textured spot. We're going to pull this down 90 degrees, and then it comes out. This is the magazine tube from the Spencer. Let's have a slot in the side. Got a magazine spring and a follower up here. And of course this follower goes all the way back in. What you would do to load this is drop 5 rounds into the magazine of the gun, into this tube, and then push the follower in behind them, rotate up 90 degrees, lock it in place, and then you're ready to fire again. So the sights on the Spencer aren't really anything of particular note. They're pretty similar to everything else of the era. Very small little notch and a small front post. Some of the tension has gone from this slider. And there's our front sight. So the Spencer rifles were very much well liked by Union cavalry, Union soldiers in general. Like I said, over 100,000 of them were manufactured and purchased by the US military. Unfortunately for Christopher Spencer, they were pretty much obsolete by the end of the war, and he didn't make very many sales at all after the war, and his subsequent company went out of business fairly quickly. They did remain the primary issue arm for U.S. cavalry, particularly out west, until the mid-1870s. They were used in particular in wars against the Kiowa and the Modoc, and cavalry troops out west liked them very much. There is an interesting dichotomy between these rifles firing their relatively low-powered cartridges, but having 7 of them available, versus what replaced these rifles in U.S. service, which was the trapdoor Springfield, which of course fired a much more powerful and longer-ranged cartridge, but it was a single-shot design. The U.S. Army looked at that and deliberately made the trade-off to have a lower-powered or a higher-powered single-shot rifle instead of the rapid firepower at close range offered by this. Whether that was a wise decision or a poor one kind of depends on who's asking and on the tactics that were put to use.
I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something about this rather unusual version of a very cool, iconic, and underappreciated rifle. Of course, this is Rock Island Auction House, so this rifle is for sale coming up in December. If you want to add this to your own collection, you can certainly do so. There's a link right below to Rock Island's auction page, has all of their high-res pictures, and a place where you can go ahead and place a bid for it online if you'd like to take a crack at owning it yourself. Good luck, and thanks for watching.